Welcome to Wandering Jews at J Squared Adventures. Travel far enough and you meet yourself. We're your hosts.
I'm Scott Copeland.
I'm Rivka Brahma. I want to invite us at J Squared Adventures for a short walk in Berlin along the banks of the Spree River. In the midst of one of Europe's largest cities, we will see a palace. It's not a royal palace, but it's a palace of human memory and creativity, one of the largest museum centers and one of the most impressive collections in the world, Berlin's Museum Island. It's not a full island. It's basically surrounded by the river banks.
Right. It's surrounded on three sides by the Spree River. When you're at Museum Island, I think there's a sense that civilizations from across time are speaking to you. Babylonian gates, and they're gazed in this blue. Egyptian queens carved for eternity, these incredible sculptures, and Greek altars reborn in stone. It's not just a collection. It's really a colossal ledger of human genius, conceived in the spirit of the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant famously saying about the Enlightenment as a period, the motto, dare to know. That would be a good license plate. Dare to know.
A t-shirt.
A t-shirt, right. The museums were imagined as kinds of temples of knowledge for all the citizens of Berlin, of Germany, and beyond. From the very beginning, though, the Universalist message carried another undertone. There was also the ambition to glorify Berlin as a symbol of German greatness.
For example, the Altes Museum's neoclassical facade. This facade echoes Athens. It looks like a Greek temple. But on the other hand, it also emphasizes and gives a grander sense of Prussian pride.
At the Pergamon Museum, the reconstructed monuments from ancient cities, Babylonian gates, Greek altars, they were trophies of scholarship and of empire, signaling that German science, German power, German might could rival Britain and France.
This tension between the dream of shared humanity and the desire of national prestige runs like a fault through the line of this island's history.
So in 1830, with the opening of the first museum on Museum Island, the Altes Museum, you could see that attempt to capture something about the classical world. These Ionic columns and an inscription above the doors that in a way mimicked or imitated the ancient Greek Roman desire of the humanities, the universal, great beauty, philosophy. And it says, up until this day, for the study of every kind of antiquity and of the liberal arts. And again, this idea of looking back to the past and trying to base the present on a greater vision, on a wider scope, on a more, perhaps, humanistic message.
Across the island, the new museum and the Pergamon Museum assembled entire ancient worlds, like a full-on mini Disney version of ancient cultures. The Ishtar Gate, the Pergamon altar, and the Market Gate of Miletus. Immense reconstructions that reflects German scholarly ambition and cultural self-assertion. The connection that they made between classical, huge creations into the German ideology and the German self that they were looking for was very clear, and it's very clear when you stand there.
Yeah, and part of, I think, the logic of museums, at least in modern times, is this idea of collection. You know, gathering stuff, categorizing stuff, putting it on shelves, creating the galleries, you know, having a map. Everything has to be on the right shelf, so to speak. And when you visit and you see the Pergamon altar outside of the Pergamon Museum, it's showing these cosmic battles of gods and giants from Greek mythology, but it really dramatizes the Enlightenment's battle, reason overcoming chaos. And nearby, the Market Gate of Miletus that you mentioned, it's like this triumphal arch. We, in this case, Berlin, Germany, can become an empire, and the triumphal arches that once graced cities like Athens or Thessaloniki or Rome.
Or Mesopotamia.
Or Mesopotamia, exactly. We will see these in the streets of Berlin as well as a kind of a reincarnation of the ancient power and grasp of these old empires.
So this wasn't a unique attempt, right? Where does Museum Island stand among great imperial museums? We know the British Museum, the Louvre, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Every big nation has this sense of let's curate, let's collect, like you said, something for people to come and flock to and get a sense of history and a sense of order.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of times these museums, they are kinds of secular temples, and particularly, again, in the way they were built in the 18th and 19th centuries. Think about some of the places you just mentioned. They're kind of architectural stages, and on these stages, the various empires, they performed their cultural authority. These soaring halls, these monumental staircases said to visitors, this is civilization. We're its stewards. We're the ones who embody the ancient messages of representing what is the top, the apex of humanity.
So museums become a sacred place or are treated sometimes as sacred place. There's different code of conduct. When you go there as a child, there's an explanation to you what you can or cannot do. You can touch, you cannot touch. Definitely classical museum, which you absolutely cannot touch. This idea of being separated from regular life is important to create a sense of holiness, of grandeur, of a secular, as you said, a secular temple. But it's also an instrument of political power. As we can see, palaces were nations curated not only to create artifacts, but also to establish identity, to understand who we are as a people, and definitely for showcasing who we are as a people.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's an issue of prestige here. And you can see it today when you visit, for example, the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, not in Paris, the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. It's an incredible, striking example of this same pattern. It's a kind of an architectural jewel in the luminous dome. It's a kind of a brooch which is placed on the Gulf, and it's an invitation for outside visitors. Join us. We're part of the family of nations. We're up there with all the other great museums and cities of the world. And it's also a declaration, kind of, we've arrived. Picture someone who, goes to a fancy ball or, a great event at a beautiful restaurant or an amazing museum or an opera house. And, they dress to the nines, right, and they put on their best suit or tuxedo, and women put on their most gorgeous gowns and their incredible, diamonds. It's both saying, hey, this is special. It's marking it as something out of the ordinary, hence sacred in a way. But at the same time, it's also saying, hey, I'm here. Look at me.
Right. It's not by chance that they chose the Louvre name and they didn't call it the Abu Dhabi Museum, right? The Louvre has some kind of prestige that they want to, well, now with the latest theft, we don't know, but it used to be, or it still is, a name that you want to be associated with. So you could see cities that are looking to remarket themselves, rebrand themselves, putting a lot of money into new museums, sometimes by taking an old museum's name and creating a new branch, and sometimes by bringing a world-renowned architect to build a new museum. We're thinking of Bilbao, for instance, other museums who understand that having a great museum is important for their city's life.
Definitely. It's part of being an actor on the global cultural stage. And in that sense, the museums are also mirrors. They tell a story of nations that they want the world to believe them, to see them in a certain way. It's a kind of a branding. It's about the story also that the country wants to believe about itself. And, as we're walking through museums, one of the questions maybe is when we're visiting different museums, walking through their galleries, what makes a particular museum not just beautiful, because there are a lot of beautiful places in the world, but meaningful. If we're going to use this idea of like the modern sacred temple or the modern secular temple, what makes it sacred space, and what are the things that each one of us kind of tie into, are impressed by, are touched by, inspired by, when we visit a particular museum and see a particular artifact, painting, piece of sculpture, whatever it might be.
I personally love museums. I feel like you get to pick and choose where you stand, and I have pivotal moments of me standing in front of a painting, a sculpture, a work of art, really feeling moved and really asking myself questions about myself. And I think that's what a good museum is about. But This deep need of people to curate things, to collect things, to showcase them is, you look at children, they do it all the time. They take out their toys, they showcase them, they put them together. So that's an ancient need. And when we were looking at what is the first museum that we know about the Princess Enigandinanda. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I don't think there's ancient Mesopotamian people around to correct me, so we'll go with that. Who was the daughter of one of the biggest kings of Mesopotamia, who created a museum in her own house using artifacts. And there were findings of labels, basically, written on clay saying it's not only important to showcase them, but you need to have a little of an inscription. What is this? Where did it come from? And this sense that people have to put order in their life and to put order into their own story, either as a nation or as a person, is something that museum definitely taps across. And a good museum is a place that tells a story of an identity or an idea.
Yeah, it's just, thinking about it. I mean, we definitely do this in our house, and I think everyone does. Think about like the stuff you have on display, whether it's books, family pictures, souvenirs from trips you've taken, a chunk of rock that you found at a particular place, and, now it's on the bookshelf. We all do that. And again, it's a part of that drive to make sense of who we are for ourselves, but also that drive to, share that story, let other people know, even when people come into the house and they take a look, and obviously they don't know all the backstory, and you're not going to do a guided tour of your house, I hope, but that sense of, hey, the objects that we cherish, they say something about who we are, who we want to be.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in that sense, the Museum Island, I think, it's an amazing example, because this idea of cherishing, of identity, of showcasing, it was part of the drive of building the place, but it was also part of the drive that brought a number of very significant Jewish, mainly philanthropists and donors, who were involved with the setting up of Museum Island. And it's a story that isn't typically told,
right?
At least not at Museum Island in the past, and even today to a very, very large extent. But among those names was a German Jewish philanthropist, James-Simon. He donated over 10,000 objects, and he funded critical archaeological work all over the world. His enormous generosity to the funding of these excavations, to the arts, to the building of the museum, he was one of the people who really helped create Museum Island as a world-class center for culture, creativity, and again, for Berlin as an incredible showcase of international culture.
So James-Simon was born into a prosperous Berlin Jewish merchant family that made their wealth through the textile trade. Simon belonged to the first generation of Jews that benefited from the German emancipation. The emancipation is the period of time at the end of the 18th century that Jews were given freedoms that they didn't have up until now by the law of Germany. And his family was very, very prominent in German life, and he dedicated most of his money.
Yeah, and the economic success of this family, obviously not all Jews were part of the Berlin elite or the German elite, but in the case of the Simon family, their economic success, it opened doors into banking, finance, led to philanthropy. They became really champions in Berlin's liberal intellectual society, and James-Simon himself really joined the cultural elite of Berlin, the capital of Germany, at that time.
His most iconic gift to the Museum Island is the bust of Nefertiti. Nefertiti from Egypt, one of the queens of Egypt, that was discovered in 1912. The bust shows Nefertiti with her tall blue flat-top crown, finely modeled and symmetrical features as long, swan-like neck, vividly painted with colors that make her appear very lively. Think Elizabeth Taylor, Cleopatra kind of thing. That's what comes to my mind. It's really a beautiful sculpture, and when you think of iconic Egyptian sculptures, that's one of them that you think about, Nefertiti.
Yeah, definitely. It's an incredible piece of sculpture and especially when you're standing in front of it. Nefertiti was the great queen of Egypt's Amarna Revolution. So we're talking about 1345, 1350 BCE. It's around the time that we sometimes connect with the story of the slavery and the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt. But it was a time in Egypt that's known as the Amarna Revolution because the pharaoh, Akhenaten, he, or at least some think, he took part in a bold experiment that seemed to be a form of monotheism, where the sun god became the god. I mean, I'm a little bit simplifying, but this idea that the gods aren't a pantheon, a family of gods, loving and fighting and competing and collaborating, all on the background of human life and human drama, but that there's somehow one God. Wow, this really reshaped, at least during this period, Egyptian religion and art.
So maybe putting Nefertiti's sculpture in the museum is on purpose connecting people to the idea of we are links to that ancient world of mythical kings and queens.
Definitely, definitely. And kind of also the wonder of the ancient world. Again, we have this prejudice, I think, that the ancients were primitive.
Right.
You know, but when you meet Nefertiti, you really think twice because you realize, my God, this was an advanced society, people who knew how to express themselves and were very crafted and skilled in being able to tell their stories through many different artistic forms. You know, I think when I visit Museum Island and I see Nefertiti, I can't help thinking apropos the Amarna Revolution, you know, imagining Sigmund Freud. Okay, dude, he wasn't from Berlin. He was from Vienna. But I can kind of picture Sigmund Freud visiting Berlin, seeing the sculpture, standing in front of it, walking through these galleries as he was writing one of his most controversial books, Moses and Monotheism. Okay, he was the father of modern psychology, but Freud wrestled with his Jewish identity as well. And in this book, Moses and Monotheism, he plays with the idea, hey, maybe monotheism wasn't only a Jewish Hebrew invention, but maybe Moses based himself on the revolution that had already been carried out by that radical pharaoh, Akhenaten. A lot of historians don't accept Freud's book. A lot of them think it's a bit off the wall. And I don't know if he actually visited the museum. But this idea of thinking of, you know, the Jew from Vienna, the classic intellectual of the 19th century, walking through those galleries and enjoying them and drinking it all in and then pouring it out in a distilled fashion back into this book, I don't know, it makes sense to me. I like the picture, even if it's not exactly historically accurate.
Well, that's the fun thing about stories. Accuracy is not always the most important thing.
So we talked about up till now Egypt, the Egyptian collection, Nefertiti. Obviously, Egyptian civilization was an incredible fad and fashion and craze in 19th century Europe. But Simon's support for the arts, for excavation, for archaeology, and for amassing the collections that became Museum Island extended way beyond Egypt and really included a massive attempt all throughout the ancient Near East or the ancient Middle East to collect and excavate and bring these pieces so that viewers could see them in Berlin.
So one of those monumental pieces is the Ishtar Gate from Babylonia. The monumental gateway once framed the northern city entrance of Nebuchadnezzar, the imperial capital of the time. What we remember from the Babylonian exile from our own Jewish stories. And it makes you wonder whether Simon was fully aware of this irony of him bringing that symbol of Babylon and exile into Germany and paying for it and using his money, or he was just trying to, you know, be a good Berliner and do what he can do for Berlin's culture and be accepted maybe as one of the cultural elites. We don't know.
Yeah, incredible to stand in Berlin in front of the Ishtar Gate, really considering that this gate was brought all the way from ancient, what today is Iraq, from ancient Babylonia, to Berlin. And at the same time, it's the same gate that likely our ancestors stood in front of when the Jewish people went out from exile from Jerusalem to Babylon with the destruction of the first temple 586 BCE. The emotional geography of the trauma of exile we know from Psalm 137. The rivers of Babylon. There we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion. And again, it's part of the untold or the secret Jewish story of Museum Island, even in places where we say it's a general artifact, it's a general human treasure. A lot of times there's a kind of a hidden Jewish story, and we just need to kind of scratch the surface a little bit to get at it. So besides James Simon, there were other Jewish figures who were very involved in the funding and the building of Museum Island. Rudolf Mosse was one of them, and his family pioneered modern journalism in Germany. Mosse came from an assimilated German Jewish family whose rise paralleled Berlin's transformation into a modern media metropolis. The Mosse family's success in advertising and publishing really placed them squarely within the city's bourgeois elite. They were entrepreneurial, they were very patriotic, and they were dedicated to civic culture.
So the Mosses built one of the most influential publishing empires of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And his dispossession under the Nazis, like so many German Jews, was not only a personal tragedy, but a very symbolic unrevealing of the civic and cultural ideals that Museum Island had represented.
And let's add one more level. For so much of Jewish history, making images was viewed with great suspicion.
Right.
Yeah, right. There was always the shadowing of the commandment, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth, right? The commandment from Exodus 20.
So throughout Jewish history and throughout Jewish experiences, we keep ourselves from distance from creating visual manifestations of godliness or, in general, investing a lot in physical manifestations of art. And it's interesting and maybe ironic that a lot of permanent Jews took such important leads in creating a museum dedicated exactly to that.
Yeah, I think it has to do also that by the 19th century, again, we mentioned the emancipation, the Enlightenment, the going out of Jews to general culture and receiving general education. By the 19th century, all the boundaries were shifting. Modernity cracked open old boundaries, and Jews newly emancipated and newly visible in European civic life, they turned to art as a language of self-assertion.
Later, in early Jewish painters, Hebrew Zionist sculptors, and cultural patrons stepped into the realms that had once been or felt forbidden, not only breaking through the constraints imposed by Christian Europe, but also renegotiating the constraints of Jewish tradition with this theme.
Yeah, and this lights Simon's philanthropy. It takes on an even maybe richer resonance. A Jewish patron helping to build one of the world's great museum complexes, again, funding excavations, donating masterpieces, shaping the cultural identity of Berlin. It's not just an act of generosity. It's a symbol of a people entering modernity, wanting to prove themselves with a greater confidence, claiming a place in the story of global culture through the very medium once thought distant, foreign to Jewish life.
So inside the James-Simon-Galerie, there stands a bronze lion made by August Gull, looted by the Nazis from Rudolf Mosse's home, his personal home, and now is restored and put in a quiet, dignified way, watching over the monumental stairs of the entrance hall of the James-Simon-Galerie. I think it's maybe poetic justice, or maybe a symbol of Germany dealing with its own troubled past. Something that was looted from a Jewish home, put back in its rightful place.
So the James-Simon-Galerie, designed by David Chipperfield, was open in 2019, and the lion greets everyone who comes to the main entrance and what's the visitor hub for the entire Museum Island complex. Now, again, I don't think this was the intention of David Chipperfield when they set up the staircase and when they placed Gull's lion there, but I couldn't help seeing. I saw James Simon's name. I saw this statue of a lion. I recognized it as part of a certain classical tradition of European sculpture. But hey, I couldn't help seeing a family member, James Simon, and a Lion of Judah, in some ways hinting at, for those who are attuned to the sometimes untold, the secret Jewish story of Museum Island.
In 1933, Nazi ideology swept through Berlin's institutions. Jewish museum staffs were dismissed, donor names were erased, galleries repurposed into showcases of a racial myth, a very big shift.
Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, he proclaimed this shift as, quote, the end of Jewish intellectualism, end quote.
The Enlightenment promise had begun to collapse and be dismantled by the weight of its own unresolved contradictions and the rising tide of anti-Semitism and fascism.
And so the reopening of the James-Simon-Galerie, as we mentioned, 2019, and also of the James-Simon-Galerie at the Bode Museum, one of the other museums on Museum Island. It's an impressive collection of Renaissance art, 500 pieces from Simon's private collection, his name, and the collection, which had been closed and the pieces stolen by the Nazis, were reinstated. It was another signaling of the reversal of the Nazi dismantling of the room. It was the return of Simon's name. And again, maybe it was also a sign of taking responsibility of modern Germany for the crimes that had been perpetrated in Germany's name during the Second World War. Now, restitution and repentance are very important, but they can't heal every wound, but they do mark, and they ought to be marked as a commitment to ethical memory.
An additional figure who graced the story of the Museum Island is the German poet and Jewish figure Heinrich Heine. There's a small offset garden in one of the sides of the museum that is dedicated to him. Heinrich Heine, born in 1797, is one of the most brilliant lyricals and intellectually incisive writers of the 19th century. He's considered by German as a soaring icon of German literature. His poetry fused musical grace with ironic bite. His prose blended philosophical depth with political courage. Few writers shaped the German language more profoundly than Heinrich Heine.
For sure. His brilliance was matched also by a lifelong personal struggle as a Jew in Germany at a time when full civic acceptance was denied to him. He decided to convert to Christianity. And he famously called his conversion, took place in 1825, quote, the admission ticket to European culture. He did it because he felt it was logistically or operationally needed, but he definitely did it without a full heart.
This ticket never fully opened the door. His writing reveals a soul caught between longing and alienation, belonging and being excluded, the existential tension that makes him a perfect guide to the Museum Island.
So the statue of Heine is set off to the side. It's a small garden surrounded by shrubs. He's seated. He's relaxed. It's kind of informal, but there's something quite alert about him, as if he's kind of listening to a conversation. His face is sad. There's a kind of a melancholy.
Oh, please. We're German.
Yeah, but there's something also kind of witty about it. It's very naturalistic. It's not one of these heroic pieces of like, you know, an emperor on a horse that you see in places all around European cities. It's not too bombastic. It's a guy hanging out with, if I remember correctly, with his hand on one knee, and he's kind of thinking about life. A poet who very much loved German culture. Sadly, even as he felt very much pushed to the margins and even felt pushed out of the door, quite literally, because he himself lived a life in exile outside of Germany for many years of his life.
Right. So basically, Museum Island through Heine eyes or Museum Island through Simon's eyes are very different experiences.
On the other end of the island's cultural axis lies the Bebelplatz. It's the opposite side of the avenue from Museum Island. It's the square of the School of Law of Humboldt University, the symbolic heart, one could say, of the German legal tradition.
It was there, in May 10th, 1933, that students and officials burned more than 20,000 un-German books.
The memorial that now fills the square, Micha Ullmann's empty library, is a glowing chamber of blank shelves It's sunk deep into the earth. You look through it through transparent, I guess it's a kind of a plexiglass. Right. And it recalls not only the burning of the books, but again, the burning of, the destruction of, the Enlightenment, of culture as a call to conscience, the idea of the humanities as a universal appreciation of who the human race is and could be, and ironically, facing the school of law, the rule of law itself.
Hey, this place, specifically dedicated to the study of law, was inverted, extinguished, and humiliated, basically.
And in the context of the empty library, Rivka reminded me that Michael Ullmann's Letters of Light at the new National Library of Israel, it's really conceived of as a companion piece to the empty library in Berlin. So if we mentioned this idea that the statue of Heine and the empty library and the Bebelplatz are bookends framing the story of Museum Island, another bookend could be Michael Ullmann's Letters of Light in Jerusalem and the empty library in Berlin.
This idea that words and letters have power, we spoke about when we spoke about in the Golem, but we also, is a very Jewish concept of Genesis, basically of creating worlds with letters. I think that's what Michael Ullmann is referring to, and also burning letters and burning words, that empty space that is left behind.
In that sense, Ullmann's work is a kind of an architectural interpretation. It's an homage to Heinrich Heine. When we stand there in the Bebelplatz in Berlin, above the empty library, Ullmann chose to place there, inscribed in the flooring, the quotation from Heine, where they burn books, they will, in the end, burn people.
The island is framed literally and symbolically between Heine and Bebelplatz. Heine, emancipated genius, cultural achievements, and hope. And on the other hand, Bebelplatz, the Enlightenment betrayed, a culture silenced and humiliated.
Again, in that sense, the axis between those different places from the Bebelplatz leads, unfortunately, as we continue the story and we know from hindsight, to the crematoria at Auschwitz. Between those two poles, of one of great hope and the other, unfortunately, of disaster fulfilled, lies the entire story of German Enlightenment, of Jewish emancipation, and the very fragile promise of European culture.
Heine's life and warnings from the ethical horizon of Museum Island. Culture without conscience becomes spectacle. Memory without responsibility becomes myth.
Museum Island stands restored, an ongoing experiment in enlightened aspiration.
As Moses Mendelssohn, one of the outstanding pioneers of the Jewish Enlightenment, whose legacy has influenced almost every corner of modern Jewish experience, observed, the Enlightenment is not a state, but a process.
From the Old Museum to the James-Simon-Galerie, from Nefertiti to the Ishtar Gate, from Heine's statue to the empty library, the island tells, maybe, a single overarching story.
Ambition and error, generosity and erasure, identity and inclusion, all held together in one walk. As you enter through Chipperfield's portal past the lion, imagine the exile of Babylonian's gates, remember, nothing memorializes us more deeply than choosing to remember others.
Stand proudly in our identity, but never at the expense of someone else's. And now, something for the road. A tip, a recommendation, to help you make every journey your own.
Hi, it's Rivka again. If we're talking about Berlin, I want to talk about one of the greatest books I've ever read. It's by Leon Feuchtwanger. Excuse me if I'm not articulating the name correctly, but it is a German name. Leon Feuchtwanger wrote the book The Oppermans. It's a beautiful saga that tells the story of a liberal, bourgeois, Jewish family in Germany just before the final solution has started, and really accompanies this family's disillusion with the bubble that they have been living in for a very long time. It's a heartbreaking novel, but it also, even without the historic echo, It's a beautiful story that shows the relationship between father and sons, between wife and husband, and you really start liking these Opperman family. It's a 90-year-old novel. It was written in the 1930s, really while this was happening, while this was going through. So this is like pretty much like it's not a diary, but it's clear that this is something that was written really during the time. The author, Furtwängler, and his wife fled in time and made it to the States. It took a long time before this novel was actually published, and even it took a longer time for it to be translated into Hebrew, which is very, very surprising. I read it in Hebrew. It really shows how gradually you get used to fascism. You get used to being bullied by the system. You get used to being marginalized. And every time this family has different members of the family have different reaction to what's happening. But I think it's not only about Germany. It really is about how to be a citizen in today's world. Not a very optimistic book, I must say, but a very good read. So I really deeply recommend. Whether you're going to Berlin or not, we really hope that you can join us at J Squared Adventures.
Thanks for listening. Dive deeper into the world of travel on our J Squared Adventures website. That's jsquaredadventures.com. And stay in the loop with our latest adventures on all our social media platforms. Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all under J2 Adventures.
And if you enjoyed hanging out with us, don't forget to leave us a comment, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, travel safely and keep wondering. I'm Rivka.
I'm Scott. See you soon at J Squared Adventures, Wandering Jews.